Thank you, Ryan, and special thanks to all of the groups for putting on this event. It's so nice to actually come out and do something that's close to home. I end up being in DC most of my time, so it's nice to be here and to be able to speak on something that I care so much about, very, very close to home. The best alternative to attacking Iran would be for the United States, of course, to engage in serious negotiations without preconditions. That's really the only alternative, and I could just basically stop there. Unfortunately, that really hasn't been an option on the table. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is everyone else, or is it just me that's...
It's fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just hoping it wasn't a problem for folks out there. Is that better? Can you hear me?
It's fine.
Okay,
it's
all
fine.
right, I'm sorry. So, most recently, I guess I'll focus on the talks for just a second, and diplomacy without preconditions, because we did just have, you can look at it in two ways, either some sort of breakthrough, or more cynically, a box has just been checked by the United States sending number 3 at the State Department to join the talks in Geneva with Iran's nuclear negotiator, Ambassador Jalili. And I did note that, one thing that gives me some cynicism about the talks over the weekend was that we didn't send our foreign minister or our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. We actually sent number 3. And of course, the State Department characterized the talks as a waste of time, talked about meandering. So, it's hard to say, but at the same time, there might be some hope for optimism, because the United States has announced that it plans to propose opening an interest section in Tehran in the next 30 days or so. They'll announce the proposal in the next 30 days, and President Ahmadinejad and others inside of Iran have welcomed that announcement. So, we could be seeing a change in policy, although, again, with these talks, the administration did say this was a one-time thing, we're not doing it again. Britain has actually responded to the U.S. joining, saying it would have been better if Burns or somebody else would have actually gone with Javier Solana to deliver the proposal to Tehran when he did so in June 14th, I believe it was. Given the state of the country and what's happened, I certainly give pause and question exactly what the motives were behind this, but any sort of breakthrough is welcome. We have been focusing primarily on talking about negotiations without preconditions. Of course, the United States has said that we will not talk to Iran until they suspend enrichment, but that's the entire goal of the talks. So those preconditions really become a recipe for failure in terms of trying to move forward in any way. So I want to talk a little bit maybe about what the policies have been centered on, and primarily it's focused on saber rattling and sanctions, and has really gotten us nowhere in terms of trying to make progress. Quite honestly, it hasn't. Congress's position on this has not helped the case in any way. In fact, if anyone has been following, there are there's a concurrent resolution in the House and the Senate, H-Conres 362 in the House and SRES 580 in the Senate. The House version is even more belligerent than the Senate version, but there's a particular clause in there that's been a particular concern, Clause 3, which calls for imposing stringent inspection requirements on anything entering or departing Iran. And so after querying a number of lawyers, both constitutional and international, and it would be it demands the president lead an international effort to prevent Iran from importing refined petroleum products. And so this is just a sense of Congress resolution. It's non-binding, but this particular clause is what's really had people up in arms, and some have said it's an unequivocal call for a blockade. I've talked to a number of international lawyers and constitutional lawyers who have various opinions about this, but what they do come to consensus on is depends on interpretation and implementation. And if you talk to retired military leaders or others, they say, and even some of these lawyers that I've spoke with, they basically say it's very difficult to implement a ban on importation of products or such stringent inspection requirements without a blockade, whether that's by land, air, or sea. So there's been a lot of movement from grassroots groups being very upset about this, because this, and all across the country, and that's part of what this last weekend has been about in terms of organizing community events. I know there were a number of actions all across the country, and I know there's a number of organizations who are in DC today and tomorrow lobbying their members of Congress on this resolution, which is really the current face of sanctions, quite honestly, but it's been sort of a consistent effort by Congress to ratchet up sanctions on Iran. And people ask, well, why take action? Why ask our members not to co-sponsor this bill or to get off this resolution? Right now, there's 247 co-sponsors, and I think, quite honestly, most members of Congress didn't read the legislation. They signed on because they were asked to. It was a very specific lobbying effort to garner support for this resolution at the end of May, the beginning of June. But I don't really think, we've been using this as an education opportunity to reach out to members of Congress, because even if this is a non-binding resolution and it's not going to turn into law, it sends the wrong message to this administration and to the Iranians. We really need to be bolstering the case for diplomacy, because that is really what has been sorely missing from any sort of strategy. The other thing, in addition to sanctions, is, and I should say that, so at the end of 2006, Congress extended the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, but they dropped Libya, so we sort of renewed that sanctions bill, and so we've kept basically in place the same amount of sanctions since 1996. And then last year, the House of Representatives passed the Iran Counter-Proliferation Act of 2007, which would expand more sanctions. The Senate never took up the measure, and now there are 3 different versions of it that are circulating, and it's unclear with the legislative calendar what's really going to happen. It seems unlikely that anything will, at least before the congressional recess in August. But it should be noted that the administration actually hasn't prosecuted any of these cases that were brought to them regarding companies who have violated sanctions. I think only one case since 1996 has actually been prosecuted, because these sanctions really would hurt U.S. allies, primarily in Europe and Japan. These aren't sanctions against Iran itself. But the Europeans, of course, have now started ratcheting up their own sanctions under pressure from the administration. And the administration has also pursued, the multilateral sanctions through the United Nations Security Council. 4 resolutions have been passed, 3 of them imposing sanctions since 2005. But really, I think we have to look at it best from Iran's point of view in terms of their history of coercion by foreign powers and whether or not sanctions would work. And I think if we look at Iran's history and from their psychological point of view, I think people would realize if they actually had an inkling of understanding, which really seems to be missing. There's very little expertise on Iran in this administration and in this Congress. But Iran, in the past has not cowed to pressure from sanctions or international pressure. In fact, they continue to stand up to it. And I think probably the best person who has articulated this is Professor Ruia Ramazani, and he wrote an excellent op-ed which was published in the Charlottesville Daily Progress on this specific issue about understanding Iran's psychology in terms of coercion by foreign powers. The other part of the Bush administration policy towards Iran has really been characterized by the goal of regime change in Iran. And Iran has really been on a list along with a number of other countries in the Middle East, and it was just supposed to be another one along with Syria, Iraq, and a list of 7 countries actually, in which this administration, when they came to power, thought that they were going to come through and replace these regimes and make it a democratic Middle East, a Middle East that was more friendly to the United States. I think also if you look back, this regime change policy is also apparent in the sanctions bills that percolated up through Congress. And there's another element to it, which is through a quote-unquote program to promote democracy in Iran that's funded through the State Department. And so far the program has gotten over $120 million. But what they have found is that they can't get, it was meant primarily to increase broadcasting to Iran through Voice of America, Broadcasting Board of Governors, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And then there was another component that was meant to give money to dissidents working inside of Iran. To help them, foment a quote-unquote velvet revolution to take down the regime. But the dissidents, most of the dissidents in Iran and those who are part of the movements there have almost nearly universally rejected this money because it's created a serious problems for them. Leading dissidents like Shirin Ebadi and Akbar Ganji have spoken out about this program. As has a number of other prominent leaders most recently, because this is actually a subject right now in terms of foreign operations appropriations that are coming up for next year and the renewal of some of this funding. But they have basically called on Congress. In fact, a most recent letter was published last week with 31 prominent intellectuals signing on, calling on Congress and the President to abandon this program. And that's because the regime in Iran has used this program as an excuse to crack down on women's rights activists and human rights activists. And there, more than 70 women have been charged just for demonstrating, for their own equal rights under Islam, under Sharia law. They're not trying to take down the regime. They're not trying to change Islam. They're just asking for equal rights. They believe that Islam, allows that. But these women have been arrested and charged and detained on national security charges. So more than 70 of them, and they've been calling for this program to be abandoned. But it hasn't quite reached Congress's ears, even though there's really been an effort to try to bring this to their attention. In fact, just last week, I believe it was on July 18th, the Senate Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee allocated $20 million specifically for this program and said that it could not be used for cultural or educational exchanges, that it had to be used for the democracy promotion program. On the positive side, they did include a provision in this bill that calls for a very close examination of the types of broadcasts that are going into Iran. I mean, I think certainly we want to be having a face through that broadcasting, and it's an excellent effort, but there's been no evaluation of the program, and there are some significant concerns about it. Because it has not been balanced or fair. And in fact, a number of the Iranians that I've talked to have said that the news programming is very good, that they get quite a bit from it. But some of the opinion pieces are very tilted, moving towards being, of course, against the regime and trying to foment certain ideas. So on the positive side, this new Senate bill at least has this provision to examine that programming. And I raise these because this is another area where we as citizens have the opportunity to really weigh in, because we can be calling our members of Congress, particularly if they're on an appropriations committee, and working to try to reprogram this funding, to raise this issue. It's not just the idea of attacking Iran that has problems for Iranians. It's also just the mere threat of attacking Iran. It's also this notion of regime change. We really are in this really awful environment that's been created where there's so much mistrust and so much missteps on both sides of the equation. It is on both sides. But we really need to be working as citizens to be pushing for the creation of an environment where diplomacy can succeed. Because even though we are advocating for diplomacy without preconditions as one of the best ways for trying to move forward, we've tried all of these other options. We've tried threats of regime change. We've tried sanctions. Diplomacy is really the way forward, but we also have to realize that this isn't going to solve anything overnight. And this is going to be a long and hard and arduous process. If nothing else, I think that's what these talks over this last weekend prove, that it is going to be very difficult, to get to that point, to allow diplomacy to succeed. And that, sitting in on one meeting, is not the answer to all of our problems. That it's going to take a lot, and it's going to be a lot of back and forth, and we have to come, humbly and respectful and be willing to listen and not just have these as grievance airing sessions. But I think that there are actually a number of areas in which Iranian and U.S. interests converge, and I think first and foremost that's in Iraq, and you'll hear this from the Iranian point of view, but unfortunately, once the nuclear program, became almost tangential after the November 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, which said that Iran had a covert nuclear program, but it had halted it in 2003, and sort of blew a hole through the Mad Mullahs theory that Iran, essentially one of the least. One of the findings that was given the least amount of attention was the fact that Iran is making a decision on its nuclear program on a cost-benefit analysis, and that if given an offer that was perceived as credible, they would be willing to maintain this suspension of their nuclear weapons program. I think that was a very important point that often gets overlooked. It's not just the fact that they halted their covert nuclear program, which there are questions about whether or not Iran even had a covert nuclear program. But I think that finding was really important, and really since then we've seen a shift in the administration to focusing much more on Iran's role in Iraq, blaming Iran for violence there, and I think we have to look at that also from the Iranian perspective. I think we have to have a better understanding of why Iran wants a role inside of Iraq. Well, it shares a long border with Iraq. It fought a long war with Iraq. And there are live memories on both sides of the equation about this war. And so Iran, I think we can best characterize in terms of Iraq as basically hedging its bets. It wants to see, a government which is very friendly to it, which the Maliki government is. And so, but this Iran wants to see a stable Iraq. And when I met with the foreign ministry when I was there this spring, they basically said, we want U.S. troops out. That's the solution. Out of Iraq, and we can help you do that. They said, we can help bring stability to Iraq. But I think that there is, of course, on the Iraqi side, I believe that the Iraqis need to have a good say in what happens in their own country as well, and Iran certainly should not be, trying to overextend its influence, because that will certainly come back on them, and I think in some ways it is starting to. But the Iranians are reaching out to the United States saying, or have reached out to the United States, look, we can be helpful in terms of securing Iraq and allowing you to withdraw your troops. So I think, that's something that really hasn't come out in the American mainstream media, is that there is actually an opportunity there, and that could be used, the situation in Iraq could really be used to create more trust and to work out, to help build a relationship that really has been strained for more than half a century. I honestly believe that really the situation between the US and Iran, it will be viewed eventually as a blip in history. The Iranians originally reached out to the US in, I believe it was 1886, to establish diplomatic relations. And Iran has always viewed the United States, or had viewed the United States as someone that it could rely on when it stood up to the imperial powers of Britain and Russia. And it was really only in 1953 when the United States helped orchestrate the overthrow of Iran's only democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. It was only then, really, that things really began to change. And the revolution was really, in many ways, the Islamic Revolution was a culmination of some of the, I believe, the deep-seated angst for the United States and other powers, including Britain, overthrowing Mossadegh because he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, and then replacing him, of course, with the Shah. But it seems to me, why have we allowed this to continue on? And the only thing that I can come up with in terms of the United States position, of course, it's this very difficult situation because there is so much mistrust on both sides, is that the United States isn't really willing to give up because we really haven't gotten them back yet for the 1979 revolution. That there's a part of us that really wants to just get them back. And I think that's kind of part of the American psyche, the American mentality. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, to get over that. But there's always the possibility of changes in the future. Of course, if folks following the presidential races, Senator Obama has said that he would be willing to sit down and talk with Iranian leaders at a time and, quote unquote, a time and place of his choosing. He, of course, has toughened his stance on Iran in the recent months. But Senator McCain has said that, you know, that sitting down with Iran would produce a spectacle, that it's not worth sitting down and talking to their leaders. But I think even Senator McCain, you know, there's always a possibility of wanting to change the current route, because clearly the policies that we have pursued haven't worked. But I think it's really up to us, you know, to weigh in with members, and I think particularly with members of Congress, and really urging them to take a different stance, because in many ways they've provided the political cover for the types of policies that have been pursued by this administration. And I can say, you know, going back to this concurrent resolution, you know, we have seen a change where members of Congress have been educated, and now members of Congress are dropping off their co-sponsorship of this resolution. And this is because people across the country are actually making phone calls. They're meeting with their members in district over the July 4th recess. You know, there really is this distinct possibility, and really, even though this is a non-binding resolution, it's never going to become law, the fact that it's now in the public debate and people are raising this as a real issue, and that it didn't just get steamrolled through Congress, which is what, you know, they had initially thought that it would do, I think that's a very positive sign of the power of people like us to really stand up and make a difference. And you know, Iran is just one issue. There's a number of other issues where we need to be doing it too. But I think, you know, the fact that we have this opportunity, you know, to make a change in the types of policies that we have, I think is really important. And so I'm sure you all are out here tonight, so I know you're probably already engaged, and I'm talking to the choir. But you know, if there's any way to reaffirm, you know, those kinds of actions, they are important to stand up and to speak out and to try to make a difference in terms of U.S. policy. So I'll stop there as a general overview, but I hope that we can have some discussion during the questions and answers too.